All right, so today we're going to talk about how we classify governments, and this is very broad. We talked in our discussion on Tuesday about a little bit of the background of, United States government. A big part of that is, we take a lot of pride in who gets to participate in the United States government. And that's a big part of what we're going to talk about today. So this PowerPoint was created by Coach Green, and it's spot on. It's perfect. We really don't subscribe to the way the book describes all of this. This is a little simpler method, and it makes a lot more sense. So you've got the FTS method. F means form. The T stands for type, so what type of government. And then the last one is the structure. How is it made up? And so form basically means who gets to participate. And there are two. And I'm just going to pull all of these up real quick. Okay? So if you've had, and you guys are all seniors, so you've had world history, and I know we really start a little bit later in world history, but even in junior high, you may have talked about ancient Greece, and talked about Athens. We really credit Athens with being the birthplace, or the kind of the cradle of democracy. And they had a really, really basic, direct form of democracy, but not everybody could participate. And we'll kind of get into as far as who can participate in ours in a little bit. But in a democracy, the basic principle is what we call popular sovereignty. The supreme power belongs to the people, and there are two really, really big basic types of that, and that is direct or indirect. In a direct democracy, all of the people directly elect their leaders. And even more basic than that, depending on the size of this direct democracy, they may participate in decisions that are made that the government, government directives, policy. They may have a direct say in that. In ours, though, which is what Oklahoma has, the United States has, we have indirect. So, in other words, we don't participate in the day-to-day operations of our democracy. We elect people to go make those decisions, policy decisions. And this is what we call it, in our country, we call it a representative democracy. Elected officials cast the votes that really, really count. And that's why we say, your vote matters at the end of the day. Who you pick to make policy decisions for you can have life and death consequences sometimes. So that's the first basic form is democracy, and the second basic form is dictatorship. And we a lot of times we think of a dictator as one individual, but in a dictatorship it could be a small group of people. Okay, so the two big groups that we have as far as dictatorship. And before we get into that, let's define it. So the person or people who rule hold supreme power. It's unquestioned authority. There are no checks on their power. And the first of those is what we call an autocracy. And so this is the most extreme example of this. And you notice that Coach Green put a skull and crossbones, which I love, next to autocracy. A single person holds unlimited power. It's unquestioned. So in the modern day version of that would be somebody like Kim Jong-un, who is the dictator of North Korea. And I think we mentioned him in the last PowerPoint. And, he's murdered people from within his own family. And they tightly control information. They tightly control what the general public can and cannot do. The other type of dictatorship would be an oligarchy. And an oligarchy is a small group of people that hold power. So, and I know we talked about Russia the other day as well. Russia really is, they call themselves a republic or a democracy, and they're really not. It's kind of what we call a fake or a faux democracy. In Russia, Vladimir Putin is incredibly powerful, but he is also propped up by a number of oligarchs. And these oligarchs are incredibly wealthy. They're very elite. They have massive tracts of land. They may have connections to oil and gas, which is a big part of Russia's economy. But they really are what we would call the ruling elite. And I would say they're not as obviously as powerful as Vladimir Putin, but he really can't survive without them. So to review on this, the two basic forms are democracy and dictatorship. And within those two forms, you've got some variation. So the next one, as far as FTS, is T, which is type. So we've got the basic types of government, and this is how we distribute power. So in a unitary government, all powers belong to a single central agency. So again, think, a dictatorship or some form of dictatorship. And in most examples of that, China would be a good example. Again, they control the people through controlling information. They control the flow of wealth. They control the distribution of wealth. And it's there's not a lot of checks on that either. The other type of government, the next type of government, is a federal government, which the United States falls into this category, and it's a huge part of American history. We ultimately are going to fight a war to help decide this question, and that is whether or not we would be a federal government or a confederate or a confederation government style government. A federal government, the powers are divided between a central government or a national government and several smaller governments. In the United States, our national government is what we refer to as the federal government, and those smaller governments are the states. And then even within those states, you have local governments, county, city, etc. Okay? And we'll kind of, later in the class, we'll probably, we will talk about the relationship between the states and the federal government. And then there's a little note there at the bottom where it says the division of powers are created by superior authority. In our case, in the United States, the division of powers is really created by the Constitution. And obviously there were some question marks, as far as what state powers really were with regard to a variety of things. And a lot of them boiled down to slavery. And obviously has a pretty painful chapter in American history. But the division of powers that's created by superior authority for us was created by the Constitution, the United States Constitution. And we'll kind of come back to that and talk about how we divide up our powers when we get to the next slide. And then lastly, for basic types, is confederation. And the confederation the confederation has only the power to handle matters that its members assign to it. So in a confederation, which is what, if you think about the division between the North and the South going into during the Civil War, the Confederacy was just that. It was a loose collection of states. And these states think back to the last PowerPoint, were really more like countries, where they only come together when they designate if there's an economic crisis, if there is a threat to their national security, whatever it is, then they band together and they handle those matters in a way that they see fit. Outside of that, though, they operate, for the most part, independently. That's what a confederacy really does. It allows for these states to have a lot more independence than they would under a federal government. And then the last one of our three FTS, is S, which is structure. Shoot. I'm not very good. So this S stands for structure, and this is the relationship between the lawmaking bodies and the executive bodies. And obviously with ours we add one, and we talked a little bit about that in the last PowerPoint. But the two basic structures for governments are largely presidential or parliamentary. Okay? In a presidential structure, the executive and legislative branches are separate, they're independent, and they're co-equal. And the chief executive, whatever it is, if it's a president like we have, or a prime minister like England or Great Britain has, the chief executive, that person, and the legislature as a body act independently from one another. Okay? And in parliamentary, the executive, so if you think about the prime minister in Great Britain, the prime minister is a member of the legislature. So the chief executive can be controlled by the legislature, and it really depends on, we haven't really talked about political parties, but it really depends on what the majority party is, what kind of majority they actually have. If it's a coalition majority, there's all different kinds of factors that can have an impact on that. Okay? So what do we have? And this will be the last slide that we do. I'm so bad with this mouse. Terrible. So our form is a democracy, and it's what we would typically call a Republican form of democracy, not the political party, but that we do have a representative democracy. We don't have a direct democracy for the most part. There are some really, really small local entities, especially in the Northeast, that have very, very direct forms of democracy in terms of local matters. But on a national scale in our country, we use this, and it makes sense that we do, because we're a country of probably 330, 350 million people. And so there's no way that people can stay as current as they need to stay in terms of the day-to-day decision-making process of policy in the United States. The next one is the type. We talked about the difference between a federal government and a confederal government or a confederacy. We use federal. And again, I reminded you that we fought basically a civil war to help decide this very issue, that and in the relationship in our government, as far as the federal government goes, the national government and what we call our federal government is the more powerful in the relationship between the two, in terms of the national government and the state government. And then lastly, we do use the structure of a presidential structure, but we add that judicial branch. We have that third branch that is also independent and co-equal with the other two. Their list of powers, as far as the judicial branch goes, it's much shorter than the executive branch and the legislative branch, but the big stick that they carry was a part of the court case, hopefully, that you did yesterday, that determined that the Supreme Court, and now we understand it to be all of the federal courts, have the power of what's called judicial review. That is their big stick. That is what, for them, that's really what levels the playing field as far as being a co-equal branch with the executive branch and the legislative branch. Okay? So that's it in a nutshell, and we're going to kind of move on to other things as we go into the next week. I hope your distance learning is going well. I hope you guys are staying safe. I know that this is so different and unique. I promise you it is the same for all of the rest of us, the teachers that are trying to do this. But give it a chance. And I would say this: do your due diligence. Do what you need to do in order to get into the summer and either graduate or move on to the next grade, whatever it is, or go on to your greener pastures. But it is you're living in a pretty historic moment that nothing like this has happened in my lifetime. My dad was born in 1937. And I can promise you nothing like this has happened in his lifetime either. Not since, I would say, World War I have we seen this kind of pandemic that swept across the earth. So be safe, be careful, take it seriously, wash your hands, practice social distancing, and I will see you guys next week.